Okay, so we're going to finish talking about chapter 21 with section 21.3. As you're watching this video, you can feel free to pause it or break it up into different chunks if you want. You can work through this at your own pace, but this is just something that we're going to try. It gives you a little more freedom to work through things at your own speed. So here we go, 21.3. So far in chapter 21, we've talked about how different organisms, their populations continue to change. So in this section, we're going to talk about the roles that organisms have within a community. So just a reminder, a community, remember, that's all of the species, all of the living things that live in an area. So all the plants, all the animals together. If you're talking about as a town or a community, that's not just the people, that's everything that goes into making that town a town. So now within every community in nature, there's something called a habitat. A habitat is a place within an ecosystem where an organism lives. So habitats can be very specific, or they can be kind of big and general. Like, for example, a deer can live in the prairie habitat. Okay, so that is a habitat. But the thing about a habitat is it needs to be able to provide food and shelter for that organism. It needs to be able to provide all of the resources that the organism needs. Food, shelter, water, sunlight. It has to have all of those things that are just right for it. So a habitat is a place. The next thing is a word that's maybe a little bit less familiar to you. It's called a niche or a niche. A niche is what an organism does. Okay, so a habitat is a place. A niche is what an organism does. And many organisms can share the same habitat because they each have a different niche. They do different things, so that means they use the habitat differently. It's important to understand. Like in our habitat here, deer and pheasant and prairie dogs and coyotes, they all share the same habitat. But within that habitat, they use it differently. They have a different niche. So they're not using the same resources all of the time, and they're not even using the same space all the time because they have a different niche. That's how many organisms are able to use or live in the same habitat, because they do things differently there. Here's just an example of a habitat in a niche. So that's a hyena. The top picture shows a hyena in its habitat. It lives on the African savanna. And then its niche right there, they are secondary predators. They're scavengers, but also they can hunt. So they fulfill a role that is different than lions, say. And lions are primary predators. They do a lot of the primary kills, and hyenas clean up the mess. Okay, since we are talking about niches, it's important to just review where energy comes from in a community. Everything that's a living thing uses energy. That's, remember, one of those requirements. The main source of energy for all things is the sun. And just like our picture shows here, the sun gives energy to plants. Plants use photosynthesis to turn that energy into food for themselves. And then organisms like herbivores eat those plants, and then carnivores eat those organisms. So really, without the sun, there'd be no energy to go around. Now, within each habitat, there are different energy roles, again, based on that niche. Producers, if you recall from last chapter, producers are organisms that use the environment to make their own food, like sunlight. So plants are producers. That's the most common producer there is, remember. And that's why, just like we said, they're so important, because plants that use photosynthesis are the only things that get energy straight from the sun. And because of that, that starts the food web, and everything else gets energy also. Consumers, that's our other type of organism. We are a consumer, remember. These are all organisms that have to eat in order to get energy. Okay, there are 4 different types of consumers. Herbivores, they eat plants. Carnivores eat meat. Detrivores slash decomposers, they break down dead things. And then, of course, omnivores, like we are as people, that eat both plants and animals. Just a few examples up here. The raccoon in the top left corner is an omnivore. They eat pretty much anything. The caterpillar is an herbivore. The praying mantis is a carnivore. Sometimes it's easy for us to forget about insects, but they fit into these roles too. Some of them are only herbivores, some of them are only carnivores, some of them are both, they're omnivores, but earthworms are decomposers, and then of course plants are producers. Again, just a little bit of review with energy. Remember, energy flows in an ecosystem. It does not cycle. Okay, if you recall, a cycle is something that goes in a circle. It goes from its beginning to its end and back again. It doesn't ever stop, like the water cycle or the oxygen cycle. Energy flows. Flow, remember, goes in one direction, passing on from one thing to the next, but it never ever goes back to its source. That's why energy doesn't cycle, because energy never goes back to the sun. Energy always starts with the sun, and a food web is a better way to show how energy is transferred. Just like the picture here, a food web shows all of the many, many different paths energy can flow on, whereas a food chain only shows one possibility. So again, energy flows because it never goes back to its source. It always starts with the sun, and a food web is much better than a food chain at showing energy relationships. Remember, if I'm going too fast, you can pause this video at any time. Don't feel like you have to keep up with my pace. Just pause it if you need to. Finally, we're going to talk about different relationships within communities. All populations in a community interact in different ways, and they have different relationships within them. One of these relationships is known as a predator and prey relationship. Okay, this is a feeding relationship where one organism eats another one. Predators are the animals that hunt and eat. Prey are the animals that are hunted and eaten. This is kind of a sad part about nature, but it's an important part that predators usually are out there to capture old and sick and prey. It helps to keep the prey population healthy by making sure the strongest survive. That's an important thing to underline. Predators pick out the weaker parts of a population, which again is sad, but it does make sure that the stronger organisms are able to survive. And as we'll talk later on with genetics, those stronger organisms not only survive, but then pass those genes on so that the rest of the offspring are strong. Again, just a few examples of predators and prey. There are some other types of relationships. One is known as the first one is a cooperative relationship. If something is cooperative, that's like teamwork. They work together. Okay, some organisms use cooperation or teamwork to help their lives be easier. Okay, some really good examples of this are ants, wolves, bees. They all work together to, in the case of ants and bees, not only do they work together to gather food and resources, but they also build their homes together. And wolves are excellent pack hunters. So that's a great example of a cooperative relationship. The next type of relationship is known as a symbiotic relationship. Okay, a symbiotic relationship is when two organisms have a long-term relationship and they live closely with each other. Usually it involves some exchange of food or energy, but it doesn't always have to. Okay, so symbiosis is a symbiotic relationship? There are 3 examples of symbiotic relationships. The first one is mutualism. If something is mutual, that means that it benefits both parties. So mutualism is a symbiotic relationship where both partners benefit. Okay, the example of that is the picture in the bottom right with the bee and the flower. In this example, the flower is benefited because it gets pollinated, and the bee gets benefit because it gets energy from the pollen. So both organisms benefit there. Number 2 is known as commensalism. Okay, this is a little less common, but a symbiotic relationship that benefits one species and does not harm the other species. Okay, so commensalism is good for one, and the other doesn't really get anything out of it. The middle picture here, clownfish, is an example of commensalism. Clownfish, like in Finding Nemo, hide inside of sea anemones, and that gives them protection and shelter. And the sea anemone doesn't really gain anything from that relationship. It doesn't eat the clownfish or gain energy from it. So commensalism and sea anemones and clownfish are a great example of it. And then finally, we have parasitism. Okay, parasites are organisms that feed off of other organisms and usually do harm to them, sometimes even killing them. So a parasite or parasitism is an example of a symbiotic relationship that benefits one species while harming the other one. So the picture on the far left is an example of parasites. Those are actually fleas. Okay, so fleas, they live on their host and bite them to get energy from their blood, and that's parasitism. There's many different forms of parasitism, but it's a symbiotic relationship that benefits one species while harming another one. Okay, that is the end of our lesson 21 notes. Again, you can review this at any time. You can pause this as you're going through it. So if you need to go back, feel free. And all right, thank you.